The House Subcommittee on the Coronavirus Pandemic held its first hearing today after bombshell emails revealed that Dr. Fauci prompted the drafting of a scientific paper to, quote, disprove the lab leak theory. Take a listen.
Not one evidence of a certain species, whether it be dog or bat, has ever been shown to have this virus that somehow or another transferred to humans.
So there's 9 million reasons why they changed their mind. So 3 days after they say it came from a lab, they changed their position, and the only intervening event's a conference call with Dr. Fauci and Dr. Collins. And then 3 months later, shazam, they get $9 million from Dr. Fauci. Well, isn't that something? Isn't that something?
Joining me now with reaction is House Judiciary Chair Jim Jordan himself. Chairman Jordan, it's great to be with you tonight. Thank you so much for joining us. You had a special seat at the hearing today. You were very passionate. I'd like to know what your main takeaway was.
Dr. Fauci misled us from the get-go. January 31st, 2020, he gets an email from Dr. Anderson. The email says, virus looks engineered, virus not consistent with evolutionary theory. Next day, he gets an email from Dr. Gary. Dr. Gary says, I don't know how this happens in nature, but it would be easy to do in a lab. Those two guys changed their position after Dr. Fauci gets them on a conference call and tells them, here's our story, let's get our story straight, let's change the narrative and say it came from nature and downplay this idea that it could have came from a lab. And I think and those two guys went 180 degrees as you played, changed 180 degrees. And I think one of the motivating factors was Dr. Fauci hands out all this money. He's got his fiefdom, and these guys get $9 million grant just a few months later. I think the reason why Fauci was so concerned about having his narrative out there was because our tax dollars went to a lab in China that wasn't up to code, that was doing gain-of-function research, and now we have a leak from that very city. Oh, it can't be from the lab, Dr. Fauci says. That could undermine everything I've been doing. So he has to go and make sure it's the other theory that gets pushed.
And you bring up this $9 million. I'm going to dig into that a little bit if we can. This grant that the two leading virologists received after they backtracked their support for the lab leak theory. Where did that money come from?
No, this is part of the money that NIAID and NIH hand out. This is money to do coronavirus research. These guys have been getting our money for years. Dr. Fauci's been handing out millions of dollars for, he's been there 40-some years. He's the highest paid official in our government. So these were virologists who get the money, had other grants, but they get a $9 million grant, again, just a few months after they change their narrative. So this is the kind of thing Dr. Fauci's been doing where he's, as I said, I think he's built this fiefdom that he and Dr. Collins control. That's where the money came from our tax dollars going to these guys, just like our tax dollars went to the Wuhan Institute of Virology, right, where this leak most likely happened.
So you're all taking action in the House, and criticism of Dr. Fauci is growing, of course, in the Senate as well. Listen to this.
It was an elaborate cover-up, and it began in January of 2020. There's emails between Dr. Collins and Dr. Fauci in which Dr. Collins says this wouldn't be good for China. This wouldn't be good for science.
Look, I know Dr. Fauci. He's a smart man, but his behavior and lack of candor during the epidemic has undermined almost immeasurably the institution of science and public health.
And I'm sure that you remember that fiery exchange between Fauci and Dr. Rand Paul when Fauci sat there, looked him in the eye, and said there was no funding from the NIH for any gain-of-function research to this lab, and now we are finding out that this was all not true.
Yeah, no, everything it seemed that Fauci told us turned out to not be accurate. I think one of the things we should do legislatively, after all, we're the Congress, legislation is what we're supposed to be focused on, is we should say no gain-of-function research. And again, I think that's why Fauci wanted to change the narrative, why he wanted to cover up any reference to a possible lab leak. I think it was all because he knew this was gain-of-function. In fact, he gets an email late that night that talks about the gain-of-function research process and how this grant money that went to the Wuhan Institute of Virology didn't go through the typical approval process. It was just given to this institute. So one of the things we should do legislatively is outlaw this, say no gain-of-function research, and certainly not in China with our tax dollars, for goodness sake.
Yeah, and we've got the soundbite from Dr. Fauci early on in the pandemic when he talked about the fact that there was no chance that this possibly came from a lab leak. So I just want to play that for our viewers so we can refresh their memory.
There was a study recently that we can make available to you where a group of highly qualified evolutionary virologists looked at the sequences there. Where it is now is totally consistent with a jump of a species from an animal to a human.
And he really wanted us to believe that. And it's really interesting because you look at this 3 years later, and hindsight is 2020, but there is not a person on the globe that wasn't touched by this pandemic and doesn't want answers as to where it came from, what the motivation was, and if action needs to be taken. So your response on where we go past the hearings, how this progresses further.
Well, first of all, what Dr. Fauci, I believe what he was referencing there was the paper that he had a hand in editing and pushing.
Right.
So for him then to reference that, I think from the White House press briefing room I mean, that's ridiculous, and it's frankly wrong in my judgment. So the answer is, first, get the facts on the table so the whole country knows everything that happened. This is why I think Dr. Anderson, Dr. Gary, those virologists who initially said this thing came from a lab and then suddenly changed their position after talking to Fauci, I want to talk to those guys. I want those guys to sit for a transcribed interview. And I do think the Congress of the United States should say no more gain-of-function research. We should not allow this stuff to happen. That should be an important piece of legislation that we get passed, and hopefully Joe Biden would sign that into law.
And if I can switch gears with you for just one moment, because I think this is really important. We're going to talk more about it later in the show. But it's your committee that did some digging and discovered the documents that showed the FTC's Twitter investigation was looking for Elon Musk's internal communications and the names of journalists. This is a serious attack on the First Amendment.
It's about as serious as it gets. It's about a clear example of weaponization of government as I've ever seen, going after First Amendment, freedom of the press, freedom of speech rights. But understand this, the first Twitter file comes out on December 2nd. 11 days later, there's a letter comes from the FTC. The very first question the FTC asked Elon Musk and Twitter is, who are the journalists you're talking to? I mean, that is frightening. Who are the journalists you're talking to? Here are 4 names. They named 4 journalists by name, personally by name. 2 of those journalists, by the way, are testifying in front of our committee tomorrow. Michael Schellenberger and Matt Taibbi, they're testifying tomorrow. So the idea that they're going after journalists, and understand this too, the person who heads up the FTC, guess who she worked for before going to the FTC? House Democrats on the Judiciary Committee. House Democrats on the Judiciary Committee, and they have said from the get-go that they're going to fight our committee on the weaponization of government agencies against we the people. They said they're going to fight our committee tooth and nail. I mean, this is how wrong this is, and the idea that Democrats won't stand up and defend the First Amendment but are supporting the attacks and the threats to it is just scary. It really is.
This is a huge problem as far as I'm concerned, because what it seems like is tit-for-tat retaliation. Elon Musk takes over this company. He exposes exactly what happened over the course of the last few years, and the FTC all of a sudden goes after him. I mean, you know.
12 letters in 3 months. 12 letters asking. They asked for every Jackie, think about it. Everyone Elon Musk talked to, everyone who talked to Elon Musk, and anyone who talked about Elon Musk, they want all those communications. That is intimidation. That is harassment. That is the weaponization of government against a private company, for goodness sake.
Yeah, I was going to say that. It is a private company. They really don't have grounds to do it. Chairman Jim Jordan, always great to talk to you and get your perspective.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming on tonight.
Thank you. Thank you, Jackie.